This presentation is about the settlement of the West in the decades following the Civil War. It does not reflect the perspective of Native Americans. That we'll deal with in another presentation. In moving westward, Easterners were interested in three main types of activities: mining, ranching, and farming. Now let's look at mining first. It starts out with small prospectors. The common image that we know of people panning for gold, for example, and on a very small scale. And most of them were not very successful. The ones who really were successful are the merchants who sold them all the supplies they needed. They were the ones who made a lot of money. But the technology of mining changed in the years following the Civil War. The early type of mining was called placer mining. That's the just panning for gold in a stream, for example. That was overtaken by sluice mining, which is setting up a kind of trench here to let the water run through it, and it was a more efficient way to capture whatever metals were contained in the stream. A large step beyond that was hydraulic mining. What that meant was using high-pressure water to blast away at rock at the sides of mountains, knocking away the dirt and gravel and rock until some metal could be found, precious metals. That had all sorts of consequences. It meant that all the debris that was knocked off the rock or the mountains went into streams, and that raised the bed of the streams, and it caused a lot of overflowing, and that damaged large amounts of farmland. So there were court cases over this issue, and a lot of protests because of the environmental consequences and economic consequences of this approach to mining. The fourth type was the most productive, and that's known as quartz mining. That's what we think of when we look at underground mines, digging into mountains or digging under the earth to conduct mining that way. Now, the problem with quartz mining is that individuals could not afford to pull this off. You had to have large companies doing it, so the miners who hoped to get rich were reduced to the status of employees, usually badly paid employees, and their dream of striking it big was usually not fulfilled. A little bit on ranching. In Texas, this is the center of cattle ranching. There was a new breed of cattle known as the Texas Longhorn. They were a mix of Mexican and English breeds of cattle, and it produced a very sturdy, hardy breed of cattle called the Longhorn. Now, the problem was that they had to get these cattle to markets in the East where there was a demand for them. Now, if in 1866, right after the Civil War, cattle were worth about $4 a head in Texas, but if they could get them to the East, the price jumped up to about $40 a head. Now, that meant there were huge profits to be made, but the problem was getting them there. Now, they used trails. The most famous of them was the Chisholm Trail, which went from Texas to Kansas. Now, why, you might ask, were they going to Kansas? Well, these railroad tracks are really the key to the answer. Railroads at this point in American history were not complete enough to extend to every part of the country. So that meant that the cattle had to be driven overland up to railheads in places like Abilene or Ellsworth or Dodge City or Sedalia, Missouri. And then from there, they could be shipped in cattle cars by rail to slaughterhouses either in Kansas City, or the biggest stockyards of all were in Chicago, um, or farther east. Now, the key to doing this was cowboys. For about 20 years, beginning in 1866, this was the golden age of cowboys. Um, they lasted, as I said, for about 20 years, but they ended with a number of factors. One was overgrazing of the plains, and there were cattle who died on the way to these railheads because of a lack of food. Barbed wire was introduced in the 1880s and became much more common in the years that followed. And this was an attempt by farmers to prevent cattle from overrunning their crops. And then also about this time in the 1880s, the growth of railroads made it no longer necessary to drive cattle such extremely long distances. So the golden age of cowboys lasted about 20 years. Now, once the cattle got to the railroad, there was an innovation which was actually invented in Detroit as early as 1867, the refrigerated rail car. They would have ice that would keep the car cold. It would be insulated. And that allowed meat to be transported long distances without spoiling. And this was a huge boost to the cattle business. It also cut meat prices. And again, the two biggest slaughterhouse cities were Chicago and Kansas City. Omaha was also known for it. Now, let's move on to the third type of economic activity that was common in the Gilded Age in the West. And let's divide migration into push factors and pull factors. We've used these terms, I believe, to talk about immigration, but really migration has the same sorts of things going on. Immigration means you cross national borders to go from one country to another. Migration simply means that you move from place to place. And you had, major migration of Easterners especially to the Great Plains. Land prices were going up in the East, so it got more difficult and more expensive to have your own farm. People were displaced by the Civil War. There were a number, for example, of African Americans who went out to the plains. There was a group that went to Kansas called exodusters. Now, this was not large in comparison to the total number of former slaves, but it was several thousand, and there were lots of people of whatever background whose world was turned upside down by the Civil War, and they wanted to move westward. Some people were repressed for their religious beliefs, especially the Mormons, and they moved to what is now the state of Utah. And in general, if your business failed, if you were in trouble with the law, moving west was a chance for a new start. Now, there were also pull factors. The push factors are things that are pushing you away from where you are. The pull factors are things that are drawing you to the new place. There was a lure, a mythology about the West and the frontier that was very attractive to many people. There were also some laws that made an enormous difference. One of them was the Pacific Railway Acts. And what they did was to produce a major motivation for the railroads to invest money in building rails across the country. They were paid to do it, paid in the form of large amounts of federally owned land. Um, Along with this, there was the Homestead Act. Now, notice these were all passed during the Civil War. The South had seceded, so the Republicans in the North could do pretty much whatever they wanted without interference from the South. So the Homestead Act provided for giving large amounts of land. You could get 160 acres of land at no cost for just a minor registration fee if you were willing to move to the West. And a lot of people took advantage of that. And they had secure and legal property rights to that land. The one stipulation was they had to stay on it for at least 5 years. Now, this will give you an idea of the amount of land that was given away to the railroads. This is the Northern Pacific. You see this state of Idaho, Washington, Montana, and this black line here represents the rail lines, but these large areas, this large area on both sides of it, are the land grants that were given to the railroads by the federal government. It was very generous. It's sometimes described as a giveaway. The other side of the argument is that it allowed these railroads to be built without their being paid for by tax money. This is an ad for lands that could be had from the railroads. Now, I know I've just talked about the Homestead Act and how you could get free land, but this was the more valuable land because it's close to the railroad. And the railroad meant that, first of all, you had an easy way to get to your land, and secondly, you had an easy way to get your crops back to market using the railroad. There was another law that's very significant, and that was the Morrill Land Grant Act, also passed during the Civil War. It gave 30,000 acres of federal land to each state for each congressional district that it had, each member of Congress from that state. And it was used to finance institutions of higher education. The very first one to be covered by the Morrill Land Grant Act was the Agricultural College of the State of Michigan. That was its first name. Now we know it as Michigan State University. Now, most of these were east of the Mississippi River, although there were some on the plains and in the west as well. Let's talk a bit about farming on the plains. The biggest crop by far was wheat, and there were very large farms operated by corporations that were known as bonanza farms. Bonanza, big, valuable strike. They practiced a kind of agriculture known as dry farming. That meant they didn't have a lot of water in much of these areas. They were very arid, so they would plant deep so that they could take advantage of the groundwater, and they developed ways to do this without such massive needs for as much irrigation as they otherwise would have needed. Now, sometimes they had conflicts with ranchers who were driving cattle across their farmlands. That's one of the reasons why barbed wire was developed. This was a difficult life. It wasn't easy to be a farmer out on the plains. This was a typical home made of sod, made of earth. They call them soddies, these homes, on the Great Plains. When I say Great Plains, I'm thinking of Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, the Dakotas. This is where a lot of people settled. Now, there were stresses on farmers that were very significant. For one thing, worldwide, crop prices were declining, and there was deflation overall because of a glut on the world market. The wheat was produced not just in the United States, but in other places as well. And the problem was that you had to make your payments, even though the money wasn't worth as much, or I'm sorry, was worth more, even though prices were lower. You still had to make the payments you had committed to when you borrowed to buy land, to buy farm equipment, etc. And when this is combined with droughts, especially in the late 1880s and 1890s, then the stresses on farmers became very, very severe. The equipment that they needed to be productive was expensive. There's a phrase that farmers have, they call it buying iron, meaning buying farm equipment and almost always going into debt to pay for it. And that was a difficult thing to manage for them. A grain elevator stores their grain until it can be taken to market, and the railroads were charging high rates to transport it to market. And if there's only one railroad going through an area, the farmers were dependent on that railroad, and that caused a tremendous amount of animosity. We'll look at that more when we look at the populist movement of the 1890s. So the results, large debts, which could be called in by banks. If you couldn't pay your debts, you would lose your land to the banks. And more farming was done on large commercial farms by people who were now hired. They were tenant farmers or they were just hired workers rather than enjoying the independence of having their own farm. So there were successes and failures in this movement westward.